Okay, so as I we it looks like most people have selected a breakout room. So we've got a small group here. So you three should be able to unmute to ask questions as we go through things, because the point of these breakout sessions is to have a discussion, not for you to just listen to us necessarily. So make sure you ask us any questions that come up. I'm going to run through a couple of things. The voice you're hearing is, I'm Scott Royce. I'm the ag agent up in Oconto and Marinette counties, and you can probably see Josh. I don't use my video because my office does not have good enough internet connection. It's the easy way to say it. If I use video, I usually end up losing Zoom. So, but Josh is going to be talking about a couple of things specific within here and to show you a few things too. But I'm going to go through a couple of general things that and being blunt, I do a lot of land rent workshops up in this neck of the woods, and they're usually 2-hour workshops. So I go through a lot of information. I tried to condense things real well, but there are a couple of points I do want to make. And when we think about the point of trying to add some flexibility into a leasing situation, and essentially really looking at, okay, how can we have an opportunity to create a better situation for both the producer and the landowner? And having some flexibility in your leasing may do that. It may not be the right situation for you, but it may be. But anytime you're looking at putting some flexibility into a cropland leasing situation, the first question you really need to think about is, well, do we want to still stay as a cash lease, or do we want to go to a crop share lease? Because the crop share lease is the original flexible lease. And it is tough to do in some situations. For example, when forages are involved, it becomes much more difficult. But where grain crops are involved, crop share lease can actually still work pretty well. It can still work in a forage situation too. It's just a little bit trickier to manage. But usually that decision is pretty fast for most landowners, because they don't want to be involved in the work of doing a crop share lease, because it is a very different legal situation. By federal law, in other words, IRS law, crop share leases make both parties active managers, and it incurs a lot of different responsibilities for you. So there are some advantages, though. Of course, for the operator, it makes it into a lower operating capital, because they don't have to pay the cash for the land rent. Shared management could be an advantage, but you can probably also see that in the disadvantages slides. You can time things a little bit differently if you're the landowner, managing for tax purposes, essentially. You share the risk, and that's more of an advantage for the producer. And then the landowner can't, can't establish material participation. Now, that can be an advantage in certain legal situations or for certain individuals, but for most people, that's actually a disadvantage. And I'll show you why in just a split second here. The biggest disadvantages, usually being blunt, come in for the landowner. Now, the advantage for the landowner is that over the long run, a flexible lease or a crop share agreement may be a way for you to stay involved in the farm. If you were an active producer, it gives you that linkage to the farmland that you still own. So there's some good psychological benefits that I don't try to go into, but the income will be distinctly variable, and depending on your area of the state and your cropping systems and such like that. But we can see pretty significant swings in land rent income in a crop share lease. And there's also a lot of increased record keeping and increased communication and trust between the two parties. Because if you are the landowner, you are by law a producer. So you have to sign up for the government programs on your land. You have to have crop insurance for the land. And the last point, you have to make the marketing decisions. And grain marketing is a separate 2-day course that we work with. So should a crop share arrangement be used? Possibly. But that middle point there is one really big one that you've got to remember, is that material participation in farming via a crop share arrangement is that different legal situation. It may reduce your Social Security benefits, even may affect some pension things for certain situations. And you're going to need to revisit that. And depending on the productivity of the land, the percent of crop share is usually going to vary anywhere from, I've actually seen as low as the low teens on really poor soils to as high into the mid 30s. But usually we're going to be talking somewhere in those 20s or the really low 30% ranges. This is a different topic for just a split second, but this is a pop quiz because we're dealing with Wisconsin specifics. Which of these contracts are legal in the state of Wisconsin? An oral 1-year lease for 500 acres, a written 1-year lease for 500 acres, a written lifetime lease for 50 acres, or an oral multi-year lease for 50 acres of land? Because we're short on time, I'm not going to make you guys answer this, but I will just so that we get a couple extra little points here about Wisconsin ag law into the discussion here. The first two of these, A and B, are legal. The second two are not. And I'll tell you why real quickly. In the state of Wisconsin, you can have a handshake or oral agreement for 1 year at a time. So that's why A is acceptable, but D is not. You cannot have a multi-year handshake agreement. It has to be a written agreement. So that's, so B is certainly always going to be illegal because we've got a written contract, a 1-year lease for 500 acres. Okay, great. But C becomes illegal because of our state's constitution, believe it or not. The Constitution of the state of Wisconsin specifically says that you cannot have more rental contracts for farmland that are longer than 15 years in term. Okay, so anyway, kind of a separate little topic just to give you a couple of extra pointers about Wisconsin law. Now, I talked about the fact that crop share leases were kind of the original flexible rent situation, but realistically, for a lot of people, that's not going to be a very workable situation, particularly where livestock farms are involved. But we can do cash rental flexible agreements, and we can adjust them by some different things. We can look at market prices, we can look at yields, we can look at production costs, or we can look at some combination of these types of things. And obviously, if we only use one of these factors, it may be a little bit more risky than if we apply all of them, but it does require a little bit of extra record keeping, a little bit more work. Now, kind of the main advantage is that for the landowner is that you as a landowner can share in additional income. When we get really good years, you're going to get rewarded for the productivity that your land essentially has. At the same time, you're seeing some reduced risk if you're the operator, because when we have a bad year, you don't have to pay that land rent at the same dollar value as what we had before. So it can help you maneuver in the bad years, but then you can reward the landowner in the good years. And in the long run, a flexible cash rent situation is usually going to be as good, if not better, for the landowner as far as the overall rental payment. But again, it's going to be averaged out over the course of time rather than consistent from year to year. The disadvantages is that you do have increased risk, particularly if you're in shorter agreement terms. And there has to be that trust. And for some situations, that's great. And for others, that's not so great. And then the third point there, we talked a little bit about earlier in this presentation, not in our breakout room here, but in the presentation, that it does require communication. And most of us in ag know that most people got into farming not because they love talking to people, but because they like animals or tractors. So sometimes those communication challenges can be pretty significant. So some methods, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on here because we could spend many hours on going through all of the different options, but it does, if we only look at one of these methods at a time, it can kind of get a little bit risky because, if we only look at crop price, Well, the price may be really good nationally, but we had a bad year because we had an extra thunderstorm where we missed a couple of rain fronts, and our land didn't do very well. So that, those two things may not be correlated very well. If you only flex on yield, it's probably a little bit more realistic than flexing on just price, but again, we can have really good yields and really poor prices, and the farm, as the operator, is still going to have a hard time cash flowing even with a lower cash rent. So we probably want to try to do some type of combination, but the margin is really what ends up allowing us as operators to pay that rent. So if we can figure out a way to flex on some combination of price and yield, or price, yield, and input costs, particularly when we look at a year like 2022 is going to be, where we have extremely high input costs, then we can really protect the margin for the operator. And like I said before, when we do that as a landowner, the operator is probably going to be willing to essentially reward us in the long run, because you're helping them stay in business in those bad years. Now, not going to try to go through a bunch of different situations here, but just to give you a real quick example, say you have a base rent and it's multiplied by a factor for price and for yield, and then also on input costs. So it looks kind of complex, but it's actually a really simple little formula. So say your base rent is $100, and then you have a current price versus base price as far as the crop that's involved, or a combination of crops if you have a large enough parcel. You have a base yield, and then you compare that year's yield to whatever your base yield for the land is, and then you have the same concept for the input costs. And when you factor those three ratios into it, you multiply each of them by the $100, and you get your current rent. Okay, great. Wording doesn't look all that great, but when you look at the actual numbers, so here for a real quick soybean example, these are the bases, are the ones you see on the left. So we've got our $100 rent as the base, price received of $10 for soybeans. This land is moderately productive, so we put in a 42 bushel base yield and input costs of $400. Well, in the year that just happened, maybe, and now these prices are off, but anyway, but say we ended up getting a price received of $988, a yield, so the price was down a little bit from our base, but the yield was a little bit better, but the input costs were a little bit more. So when you have two factors that outweigh the one, we end up with paying just a little bit less than our base rent, but still very close. Now, if we had dropped that yield as well, if you see on the bottom line there, if we had dropped that yield from 46 bushels down to 36 bushels, now we can really see how a bad year can come into play when we flex on those things. Key points: if you're going to flex, you have to communicate and you have to do it properly. So I'm going to shut up and turn it over to Josh for a few minutes.
Well, you're doing fine, Scott. Thank you. Josh Kamps, Lafayette County, happy to help out today with the program. So I dug into the ag decision maker at Iowa State, and they have a cash price flex tool where we can take a look at. I put in some information from the 2021 year. So these are numbers as close as they can be for this current year. And this is what that spreadsheet looks like. There's an option A and an option B and a lot of numbers. So to just kind of share a little bit here, this option A is simply a gross percentage, or a percentage of the gross revenue of the land. And this option B takes into account some of the expenses and what the actual profitability is of that piece. And Scott will hit the next button here and we can take a look at the results of those. So for the 2021 year, these are some of those rents that could be expected with all that information that we entered.